Leanna told us that many Bible scholars have said that the Gospel of John was probably the last one written near the end of the first century. And it presented Jesus in a way that is much more developed theologically than the other three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. One church father said it's the most spiritual of the Gospels. That was Clement of Alexandria. But another church father in about the 4th century, Augustine, wrote, John spoke about the Lord's divinity in a way that no one else ever did. So John 1 through 18 that Leanna read this morning forms the sort of prologue and introduction to the Gospel of John. These opening paragraphs, those 18 verses, form a carefully crafted theological work that is chock full of claims about Jesus that are not found in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. Because the writer does not begin this gospel with the birth of Jesus. We find that in Matthew and Luke. Luke's account that we read usually around Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, the Luke 1 through 20, is about the shepherds and the birth of Jesus in the manger. And then Matthew's account has the wise men. We usually take that up on January, the Sunday closest to January 6th, which will be January 5th next week, about the wise men or the Magi, and they're coming from afar to see Jesus. But that does not appear in John's Gospel, nor does he begin the Gospel as the Gospel of Mark begins, with the baptism of Jesus. It launches us right into John the Baptist and the baptism of Jesus. The title of Mark's Gospel in the Greek, actually, is the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and launches immediately into the baptism of Jesus that we'll take up in about 2 weeks. But rather, Gospel of John goes all the way back to the very beginning of creation, according to words from the Hebrew Bible of Genesis 1:1, and I believe we maybe know what they are. His first words of the Gospel of John is, "In the beginning." Remember in Genesis, the first book of the Old Testament, it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." So readers who would have heard those first few words would have said, we're talking about the beginning of the whole story. They'd be aware that John's Gospel opens with the words that take us back before anything was created to the account of how things came to be, how all things came to be. Only John's writer, the Gospel writer, says it this way: in the beginning was the Word. In English we put W-O-R-D, was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now that's strange. How can you be with and be the same thing? And it's paradoxes that come out in this gospel. This writer identifies Jesus as the Christ, as the Word. I want us to reflect on that a little bit. This Word that was both with God and in fact was God is according to the claim of John 1:1. Now let's parse that out just a little bit. In the Greek language, that word that we translate word is a Greek word logos. How many of you ever heard that? Logos. It can be translated word. But what does that mean? In the beginning was the Word. Logos means more than what we often attribute to being what we mean by the word. Syllables that are even spoken, like dog, cat, chair. It means more than that are signs that are written down, C-A-T-D-O-G, C-H-A-I-R. It means more than words, which are simply signs to communicate with each other. In the Greek, logos means rationality. It means a message. It means a complete thought. We use that word that way when I might say, I have a word for you. And I don't mean the word is niche or something. If you ever saw Life of the Holy Grail. I mean a message, an idea, a thought. Logos in the Greek means the divine rationality, the reason that exists within God, that order of thought that makes sense of things and brings order to things. Remember from the very beginning, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was in darkness and chaos, it says. And God said, God spoke, and there began to be order out of the disorder, and it formed a cosmos out of the chaos. The root word for logos in the Greek is just 3 letters, L-O-G, log. It appears in many English words and refers to reasoning or discussion about something. We see it, for example, in the word logic, L-O-G-I-C. It's the word logos embedded logic, which means meaning or making sense of something or reason or a plan. What's the logic of this? But it's in many other of our English words too. For example, take the word that we use around a lot is theology. Theology. L-O-G. Theology. Embedded in the word is that syllable L-O-G, logos, because in the Greek, theos is the word for God, and logos is reasoning about God. Theology. That's where we derive the word is from the Greek. It means reasoning and conversation about God. Every week we're doing theology as we read prayers, say prayers together. They're crafted around beliefs and understanding of God. When we have a sermon, it's a theological work. A hymn is a theological work because it's doing something that's making sense of something that's beyond what we know, but it has been somehow revealed to us. That's what we're doing when we come and we speak of God. In the Greek also, the word anthropos means human being. So guess what word, when we're talking about human beings, comes from anthropos? Anthropology, right? Anthropology means thinking about human being, conversations about being human. Also, another Greek word that you know, psyche. Psyche means the soul, or the mind, or the emotions and the inner life of a human being. So we have psychology. It means the study of, the reasoning about, or conversation about the mind or the emotions or the inner life of people. So we're kind of familiar with the way logos is used. It's fairly well employed in the English language and refers to rationality, to thinking about, to a message, to reason, or the structure of being. And John makes the claim that in the beginning was this Logos. The Logos was with God and in fact was God. And then he says all things came into being through him. And without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. Now this is an amazing claim that everything that exists, everything that has come into being, this bench, Laura Jascott, Midge Smith, Kim Crutchfield, my sweater, everything came into being by God's design. Everything participates in Logos because God structured everything according to a divine plan, whether an acorn that consistently grows into an oak tree, or a tadpole that will develop into a frog, or a butterfly that metamorphizes into a caterpillar. Everything participates in God's rationality and plan. Gravity keeps holding us because Logos is there holding it together. All things came into being through this Logos, and without this Logos, nothing came into being. But more, the Logos is the principle of life, and this Logos is light that grants rationality to all people. That's why we may have different languages, but in time we can learn how to communicate with one another. We can learn because we share a common humanity, because we too are participating in Logos. For the gospel writer to identify the Christ as the eternal Logos, he means that before anything else existed, always there was God's rationality, God's own idea, God's thought, God's colossal plan. This idea or thought existed with God from all eternity, and in fact was God. God cannot be separated from God's wisdom, as though there's God and then there's God's wisdom, and they're two separate, distinct things. And so the claim of Christianity, and while we celebrate the babe, and the shepherds coming, and the wise men acknowledging him, why we see these things is the one who became incarnate in flesh in the baby Jesus was none other than the divine thought or the divine rationality of God. When we as Christians assert that Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us, or that God became one of us, remember the Joan Osborne song, what if God were one of us? Just a slob like one of us, just a stranger riding on a bus. If that's in fact what is happening in Jesus, we do not mean that God was a big man up in the sky who shrunk and became a tiny baby in a manger. That is not our claim. God remained the all-powerful, the all-knowing creator that's upholding all creation, even when the man Jesus walked on the earth. But God's mind, God's purpose, God's character, God's divine message entered the flow of human history in a historical moment, in a baby born of Mary, born in Bethlehem. In the prologue, the writer put it this way: the Word became flesh and lived among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. The Word became flesh and lived among us, John says. That is, for those years that this Word lived in the man Jesus of Nazareth, God had entered the flow of human history in a personal life, a participant in the very limitations, the joys and the pains, the suffering and the rough and tumble of everyday life and relationships, just like you and I. That is the meaning of Christmas. That is the meaning of the incarnation, coming into enfleshment, being revealed as a human being in the human limitations of our world. God fused with human nature and dwelt among us. This did not happen so that God would find out what it was like to be human, as though God didn't know. I've heard people say that. God's up in heaven. He doesn't know what it's like down here. So he came down and lived among us. Now he knows. That is not the gospel. God knows. God gave us the capacity of emotions. God gave us the capacity to understand things. We all participate in that logos. But rather, it's God's love being revealed through actions done on a human plane that we can understand. That's what Christmas is about. It's God revealing God's love in a human life that we can understand, not so that God will gain experience, but so that we will understand that God so loved the world, he gave his only Son. And this is love. Not that we loved God, John says, but that God loved us and sent his Son. God revealed the great self-sacrificing love in a human being to demonstrate that God is for us, not against us. Paul could write these words: if God is for us, who can be against us? He who didn't spare his own Son but gave him up for us all, how shall not he with him give us all things? When God wanted to say and get that message across to we human beings, he wanted to say, I love you. But God did not utter the words across heaven in a mighty booming thunder that would have scared and terrified us all, saying, I love you. That's not the way God did it. When God wanted to broadcast the message, I love you, to all of us weak and sinful human beings, God did not dip a divine finger into a dark cloud and scrawl across the skies a message, I love you. But rather, God sent forth the Word. Born of a woman, born under the law, Jesus was born into the world in a helpless, needy child. You could have crushed his head with one hand. Mary brought forth her firstborn son and wrapped him in cloths and laid him in a manger. That is the Christian story and our understanding of what, or rather who, Christmas is all about. We confess that in Jesus, God has uniquely entered the flow of human history. The story is that God approaches us indirectly, in a hidden way, in a cloaked way, not coming into our world in blazing glory, but in a humble carpenter who became a Galilean field preacher during the time of Roman occupation of Jewish land in Israel 2,000 years ago. In Jesus of Nazareth, in him we see the purpose and the plan of God displayed in a human life. We see the very character of God exhibited. Who does God love? Look at Jesus and see who he loves. How does God love? Look at Jesus and you'll see how God loves. How does God treat the outcast, the marginalized, the poor, the despised, the leper, the tax collector, the second-class women, sinners, those who have made a mess of their life? How does Jesus treat them? We can say that is synonymous with the love of God reaching out to them. Who does Jesus hang out with, eat with, choose as his friends? Not the elite, not the rich. Everyday people, and he was criticized for who he hung out with. And this Jesus bids us, come, follow me. We shape our lives around his teaching and around his example. And in John 14, Jesus says these words. When the disciples were wondering, what's going on here with the Lord? He says, I'm going away. And he says, don't let your hearts be troubled. Just believe in God. Believe in me. And then he says, whoever has seen me has seen the Father. Philip had said to him, well, Lord, just show us the Father and that'll be enough. He said, if you've seen me, you have seen the character and you have seen the purposes of God revealed. Love as he loves. And Jesus said, love one another as I have loved you. To love Jesus is to love God. And to love God is to love Jesus. And to love people because of Jesus is also to love God. Inasmuch as you've done it to the least of these, my brothers and sisters. Who? The poor, the hungry, the unclothed, the sick, and those in prison. Inasmuch as you did it to the least of these, who are my brothers and sisters, you have done it to me. And so John, in the prologue, writes, and the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. To know Jesus is to know grace and to know truth. Now, not all will see God in this man, because we would think God would come as a mighty king with vengeance, destroying his enemies, but that's not the way it was. And John goes on to add in this prologue, the Word who became flesh. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, and yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not accept him. And that's the story, is that many people didn't like what he was doing, didn't like who he loved, didn't like his inclusivity, didn't like his openness to all people. They didn't accept him. John reports that his life was full of conflicts and disputes that swirled around him. Some utterly rejected him and felt that eliminating Jesus would be the best solution, because Jesus became a very harsh critic of injustice, and he was calling out hypocrisy, even the hypocrisy of the religious leaders of his own people, because he could see that religion is not necessarily a good thing. A lot of evil has been done in the name of religion. I like to say Jesus came as a critic of religion, all religion, including the Christian one. So we know the story that eventually they had him tried on trumped-up charges and sentenced to death by crucifixion. But of course that wasn't the end of the story, because we have Easter also to celebrate. But John continues, he came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave the power to become the children of God, those who were born not of blood or the will of the flesh or the will of God. If you have put your faith in Jesus, it means that you have passed from death to life. In him was life, and the life was the light of all people. If we put our faith in Jesus, it says we have become sons and daughters of God. I remember when I was a child in the church I grew up in, the words of the songwriter Skeeter Davis said, oh yes, I'm a child of the King. His royal blood now flows in my veins, and I, who was wretched and poor, now can sing. Praise God, praise God. I'm a child of the King. And that is the good news. That is the good news of Christmas. That not only does God forgive us and give us a clean slate, but God does more than that. God adopts us as God's own dear children. Jesus, who came to us as that Word become flesh, was called Son of God. And he's Son of God by nature, but we can become sons and daughters of God through grace. God's good favor on those. Whoever puts their faith in him has the power to become children of God. The writer that probably wrote the Gospel of John also wrote 3 little letters that appear at the end of our New Testament. And in the 3rd chapter of 1 John it says, see what love the Father has given us, that we should be called children of God. And that is what we are. The reason the world does not know us is it did not know him. Beloved, we are God's children now. We are God's children now. But what we will be has not yet been revealed. But what we know is this. When he is revealed, we will be like him, for we will see him as he is. The gospel is that in accepting Jesus, God has sent forth the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, which is an Aramaic diminutive term that means Papa, Daddy. Our God has been brought close to us in the man Jesus. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We beheld his glory. Well, what about the law? What about Moses? What about old religion? Oh, it's good. It's got good parts into it. The law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. If you don't know him today, that is the message of Christmas. Not the cuteness of the baby, not the quaintness of the scene, but the reality that God has become one of us. Just a slob like one of us. Just a stranger riding on the bus. And he's not only going home, he wants to walk with us. The words that Laura sang was, let me walk you home. He didn't show us the way. He came to be the way and to take us by the hand and say, simply follow me. I'll get you there. Thanks be to God.